Hi, my name is Elaine Holden, and welcome to Education Matters here on Channel 96 in Nashua, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining me today. As I'm sure you have realized by now, this is one of the best parts of my week, when I get to sit here and visit with you. So thank you for joining me. And thank you to everybody who has emailed in asking about various aspects of the shows. I really appreciate that. I'm glad that you're watching. And if there is some way that I can help and give you more information, I'm more than happy to do that. So thank you. What am I talking about today? Well, I brought my knitting with me. And now you're probably saying, come on, Elaine, what does knitting have to do with education matters? Well, actually quite a lot. A few weeks ago, I was talking about how the brain can stay supple into those golden years. In other words, there's a lot of concern as the population in the nation gets older. And guess what? The population worldwide is getting older as well. What does this mean? It means because we're living longer, there's a greater chance for us to have some issues, a little bit of frailty, and maybe some cognitive issues. And this is of concern because, as one of my doctors used to say, look, I don't care how long I last, as long as I've got all my marbles while I'm here on earth. And we all agree on that. And so maybe about 3 or 4 weeks ago, what I was talking about was the things that we can do as we get older to keep our brain as supple and as cognitively aware as possible. So I talked about doing math for 10 minutes a day. Simple math, not algebra, but addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And forcing our brain to really start using those calculation skills again. Because you know what? We rely a lot on our computer, and we rely even on our cell phone that has that lovely calculator feature. Don't get me wrong, I want to be accurate. And using a calculator pretty much guarantees accuracy. And that's important. If you're figuring out a tip, if you're trying to figure out how much you're going to spend in the grocery store, that kind of thing. But beyond that, other than checking ourselves to make sure our math is right, we should actually be working out those math problems with addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, because it causes our brain to work, to rely on that long-term memory of how we do something, and certainly rely on the long-term memory of those multiplication tables that we had to learn in 4th grade. And this is important stuff. So 10 minutes a day of simple math. What else did I say? Well, I also said 10 minutes a day of writing in cursive. And I did a whole half hour on cursive and the importance of cursive and why we need to teach our children to do cursive. But the important thing for senior citizens is to continue to use the cursive and write in cursive, pencil and paper or pen and paper, 10 minutes a day. That gets us up to 20 minutes. Let's think about the other 10. Well, the other 10, of course, is reading aloud. And that is where we have prosody, the fluency of the language. And it doesn't have to be, Marcel Proust or something like that. It can be a very simple book, something that we find enjoyable, a book we would have maybe been reading anyway. But to read aloud, to get that rhythm of the language, to get our brain doing something that perhaps we haven't done since 4th or 5th grade. These are the kinds of things that you want to do 30 minutes a day, 10 of each, 10 math, 10 writing, 10 reading. That gets us to 30. Pretty good idea. And we have research for that. We have research that tells us that this is an important aspect of growing old, to keep our brain subtle. And did I say subtle? No, I shouldn't. Talk about growing old, huh? No, to keep our brain very plastic. It's called neuroplasticity. Where did that come from? Well, it came originally from Dr. Merzenich out in the University of California in San Francisco. And he's a professor, or was a professor in the medical school. And he did a lot of research, starting out with young kids, and how the brain changes as it ages. And the brain grows and develops. That's why that early childhood experience is so important. We don't put enough energy and emphasis into those early years, preschool, to make sure that children have as much as possible for exposure to a lot of different things. Because that's where that brain is really starting to grow and expand and really learn about the world. But then let's think. The research continues on and maps those changes in the brain. And what Dr. Merzenich and the other researchers have found is that the brain keeps changing with experiences. The brain grows, and the brain really retains more than we thought it did of all of these experiences, and this is reflected in the changes in the cell structure of the brain. So the big thing is that when you get into those senior years, what we're seeing is that the brain still has the capacity to grow and to change. And this is good. And then we think about the nun studies. And I know I have mentioned these nun studies before. Well, what is exactly a nun study? Well, the nuns have donated, a group of nuns have donated their bodies and their brains to medical science. So after they pass away, and we know a lot of nuns live very long lives. So after these very elderly nuns pass away, they are studied. Their brains are studied, and their bodies have gone to medical science for study as well. But what has been really interesting is that when the doctors, when the researchers have studied the brains of very old nuns who have passed away, what they have discovered is that a good percentage of those nuns had Alzheimer's. Yet on all the cognitive tests, all the behavioral tests, and all of the observations that were done on these women, there was not one indication that these women had Alzheimer's. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because those brains were plastic. They were still growing. They had the capacity to change. And so those nuns were out in their communities. They had work that they continued to do every single day. They did not retire. They were in a very regular pattern for their vocation, really. And by staying active, by working with children, by working with other adults, depending upon what their jobs were, and by staying in that position where they were learning new things and making their brains work, they were able to kind of bypass all of those little barriers and all of the damage that the Alzheimer's disease was really creating in their brains. Their brains were working around the Alzheimer's. That's pretty interesting stuff. And now we have to think, well, first of all, most senior citizens are doing just fine. When we're looking at cognitive decline, we're looking at cognitive decline in a really small percentage of the population. But for that percentage, it's pretty significant. And we also have to remember, we're kind of afraid that this might be happening to us someday. So we need to make sure that we are doing as much as we can to either stave off dementia or to not have any dementia whatsoever. And that can be, in fact, the case. But we have to exercise our brains, just like we exercise our bodies. Nobody is saying sit on the couch and eat junk food and do nothing all day. What is being said is you eat healthy food, you get up, you walk around, you exercise, you keep your body moving. Well, we should be doing the same thing with our brains. We should be eating the right foods, drinking water, and exercising. And that's why I was talking about that 30 minutes a day of exercise and why important it is, okay? Why is that important? And so part of the exercise is also knitting. Now, I was not a knitter, believe me, but I started reading this research and I just found it so compelling that I was thinking to myself, you know what? I read out loud as it is because I work with children every day. Heaven only knows I write more than 10 minutes a day in cursive. And yes, I do 10 minutes of math or more without a calculator. But this really intrigued me about the knitting. Why we don't have it with crocheting or needlepoint or anything else, I don't know. And it's funny that the researchers have kind of narrowed down this whole concept of what we need to do to keep our brains active and our brains vital and have that plasticity really kicking in and doing good things. And they really focused on the knitting. So there was some research initially about what do these people do that gets them to keep their brain going. And they focused in and found it was the knitting. So yeah, that's where the research is centered. And that's where the research is telling us some pretty good things are happening. So here I have my knitting. Now, obviously, I'm wearing my knitting as well. I think I just messed up my microphone. I may be in trouble. And so I'm wearing some of my knitting, but I also have some of my knitting. Now, this part is just your basic stitch, and it's knit, 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 back and forth. Not a big deal. It's the first stitch you learn, really. The second stitch is a slip stitch, and then we get into the cabling. Cabling and knits and purls together make this pattern. Patterns in knitting are very mathematical. And so in order to be able to create a pattern, you need to be able to do math. You need to be able to figure out how many places you do the repeats, what kind of continuation of the pattern you need. It's a very mathematical, very precise approach to creating something that I think is hopefully going to be pretty attractive. I'll probably be wearing it on camera in a few weeks. And when we think about this, we have to say, wow, you know, there's something to that. There's enough to that if we look at the curriculum in schools, not public schools, interestingly enough, for the most part, but private schools. We see a number of private schools, starting in first grade, teaching children to knit. So obviously somebody has caught on to this, and I would suspect that part of it was what we call anecdotal information. That means that the information is kind of like word of mouth. We think this works. We've seen good results from it. We don't have statistical information on it because we haven't done all the statistically significant studies. But as teachers, we can see that this has made a difference, so let's keep on doing it. And that's really where I think the knitting had started, starting in first grade in many private schools. And these private schools have continued on for many, many years teaching children to knit. And I know there's a gender bias. It's one of these things where you think, well, girls knit, women knit, old ladies knit. You don't see a lot of men knitting. Although I will tell you, I belonged to a knitting group for years, and a couple of guys showed up every week and did some beautiful stuff. And I know I've been places, and I complimented one woman on this lovely lace knit she had, and she said, yeah, my husband does it, it's a hobby. So we know men knit. So if we can get past that gender bias for a little bit of time, we need to see what this knitting is all about. Well, it's precision, it's mathematics, it's attention to detail, it's hand-eye coordination. All of these things are really very good. not just for senior citizens, but for youngsters as well. Because when I pick up a set of needles, I have to read a pattern. I have to conceptualize what that pattern really looks like, what it's going to look like at the end. I have to figure out how to actually manipulate a third needle when I'm cabling, and that's also important. And so you have to have a lot of dexterity. You have to be able to manipulate things pretty much with all of your fingers. And this is what I find really critical. Many children are coming into school today with underdeveloped, what we call underdeveloped phalanges. In other words, these fingers, these three fingers, tall man, ring man, and pinky, are not well developed. And sometimes pointer isn't either. What we're seeing is overly developed thumbs. This is of concern. And why do we see overly developed thumbs? Because children are working those handheld devices and they're doing computer games. Now, I have talked about computer games and game addiction. And I will tell you that while the DSM-5 does not recognize computer gaming as an addiction, the World Health Organization does. Gambling is the only addiction that we're really looking at with the DSM-5. A lot of people are challenging this, by the way. We're seeing overuse, however, of these handheld games. Overuse to the point that it is of concern to educators, it is of concern to psychologists, and it's of concern to researchers. So we're seeing a far greater number of children coming in with overdeveloped thumbs and underdeveloped fingers. This means they're not able to hold a pencil well or sustain the writing process. And they really, because they're underdeveloped in their hands, they're really not able to hold crayons and color and draw and develop along that continuum that is expected for school-age children. So naturally, we want to somehow, curb this trend for the overdeveloped thumbs and the underdeveloped fingers. One way to do this is by teaching children to knit, both boys and girls. And as I said, get past the gender stereotype and think about the children, male and female, who should have some type of manipulative that allows them to develop coordination and skill and precision with their fingers, develop muscles, not just for muscle control, but for enough strength to sustain the writing process, because this is going to be important throughout their lives and certainly into the golden years when you have to be writing 10 minutes a day in cursive to keep your brain subtle. Why am I getting this word subtle? To keep your brain plastic. And so these are the things, we start them out at a very early age and they keep this pattern going. And they get taught that this is an important thing, an important aspect of their growth and development and continuation all the way through their lifespan. And so now think of the patterns and the designs and think what the brain has to do to conceptualize the patterns and designs, and think of the math involved. And when we start to look at pattern design, pattern development, when you're trying out a pattern and you say, wow, that didn't work quite well, I'm going to have to take these lines out and I'm going to have to try it again in a different direction or try it again with different stitches. And it's that continuation of thinking, conceptualizing, trying it out, working it through until they have a pattern that's very mathematical and a pattern that's very attractive and something they can certainly be proud of, but something that they have created with their hands that has allowed all of these fingers to develop. And these are the really critical things that we look at when we see first, second, third, etc. graders learning to knit. Obviously, the first thing they're going to do is knit back and forth. And then they learn to purl. Then they learn to possibly cable. Maybe they're doing yarn overs, whatever the sequence of skills happens to be. But they're learning it in small increments. They're very successful at this. And the concept of mathematics and developing that sense of number and the sense of use of math becomes well integrated into who they are. And now we have children that have a better sense and a greater chance of success in mathematics because they've had a nice, solid, practical application. They have learned to use math in their daily lives. It's no longer abstract. Math is not an abstract skill any longer. Math is, in fact, hands-on, practical, clearly multi-sensory, and it really has a beautiful reward. And so that's the sort of thing where knitting becomes a cool thing to do. Plus, they can knit scarves, and they can maybe at some point knit a hat, and then what? If they have enough scarves and enough hats, they can donate them to a very worthwhile cause. And there are a lot of people that in the world that need hats and scarves. And if these kids can donate their work so that they feel really good about helping somebody else, what better could that be? I think that's a really good aspect of education, sharing of themselves. And sometimes kids feel frustrated that they see want, they see need, and they don't know how to help, but they want to. Think about having them able to knit a scarf and donate it to somebody who needs to stay warm in the winter. That's the kind of thing kids can do that will make them feel really good about themselves and get on the right path of giving to others. So here we have senior citizens who have picked up knitting. And as I said, I have picked up knitting quite late in life, and I actually have to learn a new stitch. I have to learn the intarsia stitch because the next pattern is going to be aquamarine on this side and medium green on the other, and I have to be able to combine those two colors in a way on the back side of this shawl without it being lumpy or bumpy or having that combination shown. So I have to learn that stitch. I'm going to have to go on YouTube, and I'm going to have to watch several of them, probably many times, before I get that stitch right. But I'm going to force my brain to do that. And I'm going to force my hands to mimic what I see on YouTube. And by doing this and making this happen and integrating it into the repertoire of skills I have as a knitter, I have not just expanded my repertoire of skills, but I've done something new and something different and asked my brain to do something new, something different, certainly at every line of this shawl. And that means that I'm forcing that neuroplasticity. I'm making my brain change because I'm asking it to do something different. And that's really what we want to do right across the lifespan, but most importantly, as we get older. Because if we get into a groove and we keep doing the same old, and we don't change things up, we're not making our brain work as hard as it needs to work in order to really retain that neuroplasticity. Utilize the neuroplasticity, make the brain change, make it work. But as I said, if we can do this with our children and help them develop that hand-eye coordination, help them to develop the muscles and tendons, obviously, in the hand, help their hands to grow and develop as they should, but unfortunately, as they are not right now because of the overuse of those handheld computer toys, those devices, those games, if we can get those hands moving and working, we have really helped them gain a better educational experience. And as I said, by combining it with the knitting and having both boys and girls knit and create something simple, but still something that gets that math part of that brain working, we have really made a difference in their lives. Now, I know I'm not going to change public education by saying everybody should be knitting for 15 or 20 minutes. That's not going to happen. We know that. But we also know that here in the state of New Hampshire, we have a number of private schools. And those private schools have a lot of flexibility, and they have a lot of opportunity to apply the research that is showing that something such as knitting is a very important skill to develop. We also have homeschoolers, and homeschooling parents are quite open to having those various experiences and exposures available to their children so that their children can grow and develop and really become well-rounded individuals. And so I'm really appealing to all parents. If you have a child in a public school, as I said, I'm not changing the world here. I can't really get public schools to do something like this. But I can say that there are knitting groups for kids, that there are weekend knitting classes and knitting groups, and maybe you might even want to start one. I'm also saying that private schools have this as an opportunity in many instances. Seek out those private schools, or better yet, if you have a child in a private school, ask them if this is something that they're interested in there for curriculum, or maybe it's already in their curriculum. Who knows? In that case, you don't have to do anything. And if you're a parent that is doing homeschooling, you have a lot of opportunities. You have classes, you have groups, you have YouTube videos, and if you don't know how to knit yourself, this might be a good opportunity to learn, to start getting your brain nice and flexible and ready to go, because your brain is aging just like everybody else's. So these are the sorts of things that I think we have to think outside the box. We have to look at how we can help our children develop their hands, their hand-eye coordination, develop their sense of use of mathematics in the everyday world, help ourselves as adults develop those skills that really promote that plasticity within the brain. And we have to really investigate all of the ways that science is looking at the different growth opportunities that our brains can take and that our brains can have. So that's my message for today. This is my knitting project for the week, maybe the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm about a third of the way through this shawl. I'll be wearing it in a few weeks, hopefully. So make sure you stay tuned in to Education Matters here on Channel 96 in Nashua, New Hampshire, because I will have more information about how we can help our children and our adults and senior citizens maintain that neuroplasticity, develop that constant educational process, and really, when you think about it, become very happy and very productive citizens right across the lifespan. Thanks again for joining me.